Hello, folks. Lewis Akers here. I'm a member of the Conter editorial board, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be doing my first video for the site, an interview with a great friend and comrade, Jade Saab. Jade is a Lebanese PhD researcher at Glasgow University and has recently edited a book called Region in Revolt, which seeks to analyse the movements which are on the march in West Asia, North Africa. The book for me is a sort of novice in terms of the politics in this region. When I was reading it, it was sort of simultaneously accessible and provided me with a lot of depth and history. And in addition to this, it provided me with a really refreshing counterweight to what I've found to be some of the sort of condescending sort of attitudes that are so dominant within the sort of mainstream media when discussing this sort of region. The book for me looks at the region in terms of that are, bring class, economic conditions and the political situation to the foreground. So I'm really thrilled to be joined by Jade. Hello, Jade. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. So we'll get smashed on with the interview. So, I mean, just in terms of this book, Region in Revolt, I mean, what's going, for people that don't know the situation, what's going on in the region? What's the little bit about the sort of history of the region, like the sort of struggles that have been going on, the general history? What are the sort of broad causes of these struggles? And what's the need for this book just now? And why, I suppose there's a lot of questions in here, but why this region specifically? Why do these countries fit together?
Yeah, good question. And like you said, there's a lot to cover there. So, I mean, the best way to put it is that the region in its entirety is going through a bit of a revolutionary window, let's say, or a revolutionary situation, and has been since 2010, 2011, which was dubbed by then the so-called Arab Spring. And after the Arab Spring kind of blew over, people were thinking that there's now an Arab winter entering. And then 2018, 2019 comes along, and you have all these new uprisings and revolutions in the region, kind of dispel all of that as myths and prove that the underlying conditions in the region, economic conditions, political conditions, as well as as Marxists we talk about objective and subjective conditions, continue to evolve to lead towards these revolutionary outbursts or revolutionary processes that continue to unfold. Obviously, there is something that links this region together. Back in 2010, a lot of the media focused on this concept of an Arab identity, and it was kind of an Orientalist lens. It was used to retroactively justify intervention in the region. This was only a few years after the Iraqi invasion. So as soon as these revolutions started happening, the media kind of clamored and go, oh, great, democracy is finally coming to this region. The Arab people have awoken to, the true meaning of politics, the true meaning of democracy, and they're now finally entering like the civilized world. So it was seen kind of as the beginning of history in the region, and it fit very, very neatly with the end of history kind of ideology that ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, all we're going to see now is the adoption of these liberal democratic states, nation states across the world. All of these backward countries are now going to catch up to the West in terms of how their politics is structured. So the uprisings and revolutions we cover in this book specifically are 5 that started in 2018 and 2019 in their Sudan, Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran. And it's really important that we've included Iran in there because it breaks with this uniqueness or this idea that this is an Arab uprising, that this is something to do with the Arab identity, if we can even say that such a thing exists. And so that pushes us to look for, all right, what are the different causes that tie these countries in the region together? And what it is really is the similarities in their economic structures and their economic dependence on foreign powers or on expansionism and regional imperialism. So so you have, for example, the Gulf states, which really through their oil and gas kind of finances really influence a lot of these other countries in the region. And then you have Iran as well through direct military intervention, especially through Iraq, Lebanon. We've seen them also being involved in Yemen, also have imperialist kind of aspirations that are different but similar to what the way Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states operate in the region. So we've seen this kind of linked economy in a global economic system that has led to these several fractures and then the emergence of these mass movements, uprisings, and revolutions. So that's kind of as succinctly as I can put a complex situation.
I mean, when I was reading the book, I mean, one of the other sort of things that seemed to tie some of these movements together for me certainly was this sort of idea of, or centrality of, sort of popular sovereignty. So these movements seem to be making, like, crucially a democratic argument, because for the most part, a lot of these countries are, authoritarian in nature and, in their regimes. And it seems to me that that's something that socialists in the West could learn from, especially in terms of, for the most part, lots of sections of the left have abandoned this idea of sort of popular sovereignty. However, I mean, I suppose these movements, it seemed to me, were for the most part concerned with sort of democratic questions. Where do these sort of economic questions fit into some of these movements? I mean, how does, for example, the question of socialism, a world beyond what we have, or just striving for sort of liberal democratic reforms come in? And I suppose, like, how do these countries look to sort of break with neoliberalism? Because one of the countries that's identified in the book is Tunisia, who have had a successful street movement, but haven't been able to break with sort of neoliberalism. So what sort of role do these sorts of questions play in that?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of kind of overlapping elements in there. I do want to emphasize that because there has been lessons learned from the first wave as well, a lot of these uprisings in the second wave, or what we're calling in this book the second wave, understand that they need to look at things beyond just this process of democratization. And that's not to say that the first wave did not deal with issues of economics, of social justice, of redistribution, but it's just that because they were presented in the media through such a Western lens, they were reduced to this simplified democratization process. And what's really interesting in these cases of the latest uprisings is that you have Lebanon and Iraq in there, which are on paper at least democratic states. So you're having these processes happen, or these revolutionary processes happen in states that have already been democratized. Especially Iraq, with all the fanfare of the 2003 invasion, the whole point was to bring democracy to Iraq. Yet you still have people rising up there fighting for this kind of a different sort of sovereignty beyond a simplified just what we see as a democracy, or democracy from a Western lens. In Iraq, that also takes the form of anti-imperialism, both against US interventionism and Iranian interventionism. So one of the authors of the Iraq chapter really noted that a lot of the uprising, or a lot of the people who mobilized for this uprising, were Iraqi Shias. And although it's very annoying to reduce kind of things in West Asia to their sectarianism, it's still important to note these things, because these people are usually seen as the natural allies of Iran, whereas here you see them mobilizing for this kind of actual sovereignty. And this is a region that is also oil rich, so it's directly tied to that sense of economic independence as well as political independence. So they come hand in hand. In Lebanon as well, although this concept of sovereignty hasn't played as major of a role yet, you still saw the sense of solidarity with other countries in the region. And because it's already a democratic nation, you've seen questions being dealt with as, okay, how do we tackle the economy? Because people there have started to realize that the way the democracy is built to favor a ruling class, a clique built on sectarianism, is inherently tied with the economic structure of the country, as well as its crippling international and local debt as well, so foreign and local debt. So all of these economic questions are also coming to the forefront, which, to kind of answer your question, where does this leave, socialists and the like? It's still not entirely clear. And one of the things we wanted to infuse in this book is bringing a street level view of these uprisings to see potentially where socialist thought can slot in. It is very difficult to, we are coming up across, and by we, I mean us, people in the region, we are coming across international capitalism, which is not something that you can just, wishfully say, great, we're now going to have some kind of socialist revolution and that'll be the end of it. So there are complexities in dealing with that. And one of the major steps a lot of the authors identify in the book is building solidarity in the region as well. Through the colonial history of the region, as well as through, these complex relationships between different countries in the region. These have all been impediments to building solidarity in the region, so we can overcome or work together to overcome some of these economic difficulties. So what we've seen, to go back to the example of Tunisia that you've brought up, is in 2010, 2011, Tunisia has been touted as the only successful case, where they had a proper revolution. They've successfully gone through the process of democratization. They introduced a new constitution, etc. But just last month, we've seen new protests start to erupt. And that's exactly it, that democratization process has not allowed them to escape their position in global capitalism, and therefore you still have these same contradictions, maybe in softer form, that they were dealing with back when they weren't democratic, when they did have kind of a despotic leadership. So these are still questions that I won't purport to have the answer to. There are things that need to be worked out through the revolutionary process by the actors on the ground themselves. But it's one that, because these actors have learned from the first revolutionary process in 2010, 2011, it is something at the forefront, and you do see them grappling with these questions. A perfect example of this would be Algeria. Algeria's economy was really based on kind of the extraction of resources by Western powers, especially France and the UK, when it comes to its oil and gas sectors. And a lot of this movement really was also built on a more equitable distribution of these natural resources, very much tied into kind of the rights of Berbers, or the Amazigh, who are kind of the, I don't want to use the word native, but who are have been marginalized members of the community for a long time under despotic rule. So you really have seen this intersection of interests coming together to draft a way forward, which is still unclear and still in process.
So I suppose, just in terms of these sorts of economic questions becoming much more central to the sort of second wave of revolutionary activity, do you think that this has led to a much more region-based movement, so that's sort of cut across country lines and borders?
I wouldn't say so yet. Okay. I think let's use the example of Sudan because they have been able to enter now a transitional phase where they were able to unseat their ruler, but now they've created a kind of power sharing agreement with the military in Sudan. So it's one of the cases, it's really interesting because the social movements were able to combine, create a coalition, and therefore properly contest power. And this is something different from the other movements in the region who still remain quite diffuse and popular. So you do see popular street mobilization, but nothing clear in terms of a political alliance or a political vision, or what I'm calling a positive political program has kind of emerged from these movements. They're largely defined by negative demands, what we don't want as opposed to what we want. And there are various historical reasons for that. But Sudan has been able to overcome that. So they've been able to enter a power sharing agreement with the military. And hopefully this will be seen as a way to transition into a full civilian kind of democratic process. But they're still dealing with their economy and questions of their economy, not in terms of their relationship with other countries in the region, but in terms of their relationship with international capitalism. And that has seen them take somewhat paradoxical steps. For example, their normalization, steps towards normalization with Israel, which in general is seen as a non-popular move, especially by the population of all of these countries. But they're kind of taking those avenues to try and become more chummy, to use a very unprofessional word, with kind of Western powers and kind of release access to either some kind of funds or loans or get sanctions lifted off of them. So these countries are still operating quite bilaterally between as themselves and the powers of international capitalism. And you have not yet seen this kind of regional solidarity, which we've identified as a weakness. And obviously there are very different and real reasons why this has not been the case. I mean, a positive thing is throughout these uprisings and revolutions, because they all happened in quite a short window of time, and kind of bordered each other, you did see kind of popular support and popular acknowledgement of the struggles happening in other countries. So even in Iran, you saw popular mobilization, kind of raising criticism of the regime and its intervention in other countries, and showing solidarity with the Iraqi uprising, which was happening around the same time. You saw chants in Lebanon. A popular one was Thawra bi Kull al-Bildan, so a revolution in all the countries. So this kind of sentiment of revolutionary solidarity as well.
And that seems central to me anyway, as a sort of as someone who doesn't know much about the region, to sort of break down some of these barriers that exist. I mean, just I suppose on that topic, or exploring that a little bit more, and I suppose you've maybe touched on this a little bit, but one of the big discussions today in the world is this, nationalism, and obviously nationalism's a big debate in Scotland, with independence and all the constitutional debates going on at the moment. But I mean, what role does nationalism play in these sorts of movements? Is there a sort of nationalist identity of these movements, or is that more the sort of domain of the regimes that they're fighting against? So I suppose how is nationalism used positively and negatively in these situations?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's an interesting one, because nationalism has played such an important role in the region historically. First you had the liberatory struggles, the anti-colonial struggles, which had to see these countries forge some kind of identity. And now through these uprisings and revolutions, they're having to reforge another identity. So for the example of Lebanon, where identity has really been reduced to a sectarian identity, you've seen through the uprising, attempts at forging some kind of new national identity. Now, a new national identity and nationalism are quite different things. And to go back to the case of Algeria, you know, that national identity was a shift from a kind of totalitarian Arab identity, which saw the marginalization of minority groups, to a more pluralistic identity as, you know, we are Algerians, we have this multiplicity within us, and we're not any certain one thing. So again, this question of national identity, I'd say, is different from nationalism, which previously has been used in more repressive manners. And it's something that continues to be used by counter-revolutionary forces, especially when it comes to opposition to Israel. So because a lot of these regimes get their legitimacy through this kind of anti-imperialist nationalist identity, any kind of street mobilization that takes place against them is shut down as some kind of Western plot or you know, conspiracy to undermine the anti-imperialist or anti-Israel nature of these regimes. And in Lebanon, even though you have a multiplicity of politics represented in government, that's still a very prominent role, and it happens within all of these countries as well. So it is an interesting question in terms of, well, where does nationalism fit with all of this, with forging potentially a positive political program? And it remains unclear. There does tend to be a internalized Orientalism as well in the region that I feel not a lot of people focus on. So these uprisings and these revolutions do tend to have a liberal ideological understanding of themselves, which, as we've seen in the case of Tunisia, and as we've seen, or as we argue, some of us argue in this book, is not enough to understand, you know, where we are in history and what really needs to be done to be able to move forward. You can't use these kind of Western liberal frames to understand these uprisings, these revolutions, because those systems before existed in that liberal kind of world systems, economic world system. So it's definitely, you have a bit of a contradiction where, yes, all of these movements need to create some kind of identity to move beyond what has been holding them back, but that identity at the same time cannot be exclusively nationalist, because it's something that has already passed through, you know, and these countries are very much fragmented. They do have a lot of pluralism, and they have been intentionally fragmented so that they can, you know, continue to be in their place when it comes to the global economy.
I find it interesting, you know, this idea that you know, people in the region have sort of internalized these sorts of Orientalist understandings, because that seems to me to be the sort of, from memory, the sort of opinion of, you know, Frantz Fanon, when he talks about this idea of, you know, people internalizing the sort of colonial mindset. I mean, how does that sort of, I mean, in terms of colonialism and post-colonialism, are those sorts of, you know, because for example, in Algeria, from what I understand, the regime uses this sort of, you know, we are the defenders of this post-colonial settlement. The memory of the Algerian Revolution is a sort of defense against anybody taking them on. I mean, is that quite central within the region as a whole?
It's quite different because all of these countries had different kind of experiences with colonialism. I mean, Algeria is a specifically brutal case that has gone for decades, whereas Lebanon is also a very different case. Iraq is also a very different case. So to focus on Algeria, it's interesting because the uprising there has been able to reclaim the mantle of the anti-colonialism, because, you've seen these regimes just turn around and sell the natural resources of the country at nothing, just to maintain their position of power there. So you have been able to create the movement there has been able to reclaim that mantle, and they see their uprising there as a continuation of that post-colonial or anti-colonial struggle. For me, it's because of my research interests are as well, like I researched Cuba and the Cuban Revolution as well. It's interesting to see the similarities between the concept of Latin American nationalism and then nationalism in our region as well. And it's easy for me to draw some parallels there. When you talk about nationalism or some kind of Arab identity or any kind of solidarity in this region, it is a greater than one nation type of nationalism. And it is infused with both the anti-colonial struggle and the struggle for Palestinian liberation, which is an ongoing struggle. So it is one that needs to be, it's a complex one to work through, but in the sense of internalizing, the colonial mindset or the Western mindset or the liberal mindset or whatever you want to call it, unfortunately, you still have people in Lebanon going, and I would say these are a minority, but the voices are still there, saying, "Oh, we just need to become a French mandate country again, and that'll solve all our problems." So it's this idea that the people in general are inherently backwards, and that is a predominantly Western perspective of the region. That's how interventionism is justified. It's like, oh, these people don't know what they're doing. We need to show them how it's done, right? We need to bring democracy to them. We need to show them how all of these things, how to properly govern themselves, how to properly enter the civilized world, which is kind of how a lot of the first wave was presented. Finally, the Arab population has woken up to the great privileges of democracy, and they're now entering the civilized world. And it's completely turned a blind eye to all of the historic struggles that these countries have gone through. And that's something we wanted to do in this book, is to contextualize each of these uprisings in the historical struggles that have taken place in each of these countries. So in Algeria, we go back in the book, the authors go back to the original anti-colonial struggle. They show how different groupings within the country have changed until finally we've reached to today, and what these forces, these popular forces that have mobilized, look like and what their history is. Similarly with Lebanon, we've done the same, and we've done this with all these different countries. With Iran as well, we've Frida, the author, has covered the Green Uprising and then moved to, okay, how that has influenced this uprising. And through that, we can see how these movements themselves are evolving and are trying to deal with all of these contradictions. Where does nationalism fit in? Where does capitalism or the redistribution of wealth fit in? Where does our identity within the region fit in? So all of these things are continuously in motion, and we wanted to plot their evolution through the book by giving each of these countries their space and their independence as well, because they are, although we are covering the region as a region, it's important to, what's the term, not lose the forest for the trees, or trees for the forest, whichever it is, and give each of them their due.
Awesome. I mean, I hate to sort of mention this, but because we're all living under it just now. But obviously, the coronavirus is central to lots of the sort of discussions we're having politically. And I suppose what I was wondering is how COVID has affected some of these movements. I mean, we've seen around the world, whether it be, in places like Myanmar and China, COVID being used by regimes to stifle political expression and to sort of place a hold on these movements. But then in other places, it seems to have been a catalyst. It sparked off social movements. I mean, I suppose, how has it affected some of the movements? Have they continued, or have they sort of receded?
Yeah, I'd say it's a bit of both. I mean, for the large part, they have receded. either from state pressure, like Lebanon launched an emergency and gave the military greater powers to kind of, you started having military patrols in the streets. But at the same, and in Iraq and Sudan as well, you've had the movements kind of voluntarily withdraw, understanding the health implications of the pandemic. But this does not mean that they've completely disappeared. In a lot of regions, for example, in Tripoli in Lebanon, the movement has now started to intensify again. And people march in the street and go, well, we're either going to starve to death or we're going to die of COVID. Those are our two options right now. And a lot of these countries also don't have the medical requirements or infrastructures to deal with COVID. So any kind of restrictions are being seen as shams, are being seen as kind of very selective, very arbitrary, and being used as tools of oppression as opposed to any kind of proper health procedures. An example, Lebanon will go into lockdown for 2 days and then reopen, and it's like a 2-day lockdown. No health expert says that is a proper thing to do. So largely they have been seen as kind of shambolic repressive tools, and you do see a continuation of this movement, but I would say that it has subsided. You do see them re-emerging in really places which are really impacted by poverty, and where places that rely on the informal economy as well. A lot of these governments don't provide any kind of financial support when they do send people into lockdown. So they are in a life or death situation. They're either out there earning their day's worth of a salary or of payment, or they're not eating. So that is very much the dynamic of things. The biggest question, though, is how are these movements going to emerge once the pandemic subsides, and whether or not they will evolve, will be able to create a more positive program or not. And I'm not going to pretend to know what's going to happen, especially in all of these 5 different countries. But I will speak for Lebanon, in example. We have elections coming up, so the question happens: will this movement revert to kind of electoral politics, or will it maintain its pressure on the street? And I'm sure there will be a split. Different groups will do different things. How will that impact the movement is kind of hard to project. So yeah, COVID has had kind of has pushed these movements back, but they're definitely still there. There's still activity going. They will not be successful in completely stifling them. Even in Sudan, where there is this power sharing agreement, which can be seen as a partial success, you still have grassroots, they call them resistance committees over there, that are still very active, and if they're not engaged directly in political tasks, they've been engaged in mutual aid initiatives, assisting with COVID relief efforts. So yeah, they definitely haven't disappeared, even though we can say they have subsided.
Awesome. I mean, I suppose on, it's tenuously linked, I suppose, to the last question, but I suppose during the pandemic, most of us have moved on to social media, Zoom, like we're on just now, and social media has played a big role in how politics has been organised. But I suppose even going further back within this region, what role has sort of social media played? I mean, obviously the big sort of thing about Egypt, which I remember someone telling me was that the revolution was organized on WhatsApp, and I remember thinking, good on WhatsApp, hey, we've organized a revolution on WhatsApp. But I suppose what role does social media play? Is it quite central to how people organize and how people connect with each other?
Yeah, I mean, at the end, yeah, it's an interesting question, because Like you mentioned, I mean, Egypt, I think it was called at one point the Twitter revolution or something like that, you know. And you know, as my research into revolution and social movements, you do get a few academics, you know, touting the role of information and communication technology and crediting them almost exclusively with the cause of revolution. You know, it's once we have these new tools that suddenly we have these revolutions pop up everywhere. I mean, my view of it is that social media will continue to be just a tool, and we are talking about regimes who have no problem in simply unplugging the internet whenever there are these uprisings or these social movements. So yes, although they have been a tool that have helped in organizing, they have also helped the forces of repression. I'll give a small, like, anecdotal example in Lebanon. There was a point in time during the uprising where whenever a member of parliament was spotted in public, their pictures would be shared on social media, and essentially protesters would show up to that place and kick that person out. So whether they're at a restaurant, whether they're at a shopping mall, whether they're at all of this. But then, you know, these party supporters, essentially counter-revolutionary forces, they got clued into this, and they started setting up traps for the revolutionaries themselves. So they kind of spread misinformation and say, hey, this member of parliament has been spotted here. And then when protesters would show up, they'd be ready for them and essentially just rough them up. So you've had these kinds of interactions happen in Lebanon as well. Now social media posts are being used to raise legal cases against both journalists and activists. So use any kind of slander laws against these people to imprison them. And some of them have even been sent to the military court. So it has also become a tool of repression. In Sudan, definitely social media played a role in terms of sending out the schedules for mass protests. But then when the internet was simply unplugged, you did see the role of these resistance committees come to the forefront. They played the more active role. So it is a tool, and with social media, I think the lesson there is the importance of having alternative means of organizing, of grassroots, neighborhood by neighborhood organizing. And even in the case of Egypt, where you know, it has been touted as a social media revolution, that tends to underplay the role of reclaiming public spaces. So when you know, a very common theme of all of these uprisings is reclaiming public spaces, public squares. And that just becomes the nexus of the revolution. You don't really need to some kind of announcement on WhatsApp or on Twitter or whatever. You know that you want to be a part of the revolution, that's where you go. And that's where you'll get everything you need to. And those squares really did become hubs. You know, you had kind of medic stations set up. They became kind of open air schools where revolutionary thought was shared, where people were taught about the Constitution or about the laws. And this happened in all of these countries. So yeah, I'd say the role of social media is overhyped. Again, not a very kind of professional or academic term, but yeah, it's definitely played a role. You know, you can't turn a blind eye to you know, the ease of getting information through your phone of what's happening. You know, sharing videos of repression is also a good way to just make sure people continue to be agitated and involved. So yeah, it's definitely, you know, it's definitely been good, but you know, it's a tool that has furthered pre-existing repertoires. It's not in itself something that has presented anything novel, I'd say.
No, it's fine. Thank you very much. And I suppose just finally, I mean, as socialists, we sort of we talk about ourselves as internationalists, and about, you know, needing to think about these movements and how they connect to our own, and how, you know, there's a cross-pollination of ideas and solidarity across borders. But it seems to me that there's a real silence about this region as a whole on the left. That there's not the discussion that it deserves. I mean, we're constantly talking about revolution on the left, and there's revolutions happening, and we don't seem to care about them. I mean, I was wondering, just in your opinion, why the left has been so sort of silent about some of these movements, and I mean, what can people on the left do practically to support these movements?
Yeah, I mean, there are several reasons why these have kind of not taken the forefront, and understandably so. I'd say first and foremost is just the status of the left in, you know, in the so-called West. You know, and as an active leftist in Scotland, in the UK, I know what the situation on the ground is. You know, we're not talking about powerful organizations that have much leverage at their disposal to begin with. So from that start point, I don't want to approach this question as like wagging my finger at, you know, leftists not doing enough. What I will point to, however, which is quite detrimental, is leftist groups that actually go out of their way to put these movements down as imperialist plots or as kind of Western ploys to subvert or weaken anti-imperialist bastions in the region. For example, when it comes to the case of Iran, there was an open letter signed by prominent leftist activists that kind of spoke out against the popular uprising there, and kind of noted that this is just kind of a Western ploy. And, you know, especially for socialists on the ground in Iran, you know, facing essentially you know, the guns of the regime, that's highly unhelpful. So I think there is a definite need for an understanding of these movements from the popular level, from their street level, from, you know, how they're actually being organized. And again, with the case of Iran, you know, one of the first things the regime did after the Islamic Revolution there was to purge the country from leftist and socialist activists, a lot of them which actually aligned themselves to the regime as some kind of emancipatory revolution.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's important that we learn these lessons from the past when it comes to socialism in the region and the role of these, what I call anti-imperialist powers, or, you know, imperialist anti-imperialist powers, which is kind of how I jokingly referred to them. So there's definitely that conversation to be had, and I think at a basic level, leftist organizations or socialist organizations or whatever you want to call them should bring that understanding and should fight against that within their own ranks. So I'd say that as kind of a basic level. The second level is to understand the position of these countries in the global economy. I think one of the reasons why, you know, you're right to say, as leftists, as socialists, as Marxists, as anarchists even, you know, the magic word is revolution, but this word has kind of become so disassociated with anything tangible, with anything real, that I think when we look at these cases, the only way we can think of supporting them is kind of just giving them a thumbs up, or like sharing an article or sharing information. And we kind of fail to see how these revolutions directly relate to us. And going back to whether or not these revolutions are going to be able to surpass this kind of neoliberal order is inextricably tied to what will happen in terms of revolutionary and leftist movements in the rest of the world. You know, let's not forget the Bolshevik formula of world revolution. It's not the Bolshevik formula, the Marxist formula of world revolution. You know, we can't really rid ourselves of capitalism unless we rid ourselves of global capitalism. And I think what leftist organizations in the UK and the US and anywhere in Europe can do is understand how their countries are involved in continuing the economic subjugation of these countries. You know, what are the capitalist interests of your home countries when it comes to our home countries, and how inextricably linked they are. And that ties directly then to, you know, labor struggles in your countries, you know, any kind of popular movement, popular mobilization, and as we've seen in the last several years, the rise of xenophobia, the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment, the rise of racism. You know, so all of that is interlinked together, and you can't fight one without fighting the other. So I'd like to see us moving beyond this, awesome, they're having a revolution, yay, pitchforks and setting buildings on fire, to more in a critical understanding of the role of Western hegemonic powers and how critical the role of those countries are in the success and failures of these uprisings and revolutions long term.
No, that's absolutely fantastic. I mean, I think that's a lot of food for thought for anybody who's on the left in the West to think about. That was a really fantastic conversation, and I personally enjoyed it. So hopefully we can get you back soon. Maybe another book will be out soon with your name attached to it if you're not too busy, or just to discuss the situation in Lebanon or this region. I think analysis from the left on the region and on international questions is absolutely integral to our worldview. I think, as you know, you have demonstrated in this interview. So thanks very much for joining us today, Jade.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. And just one more thing I'd like to say, that the book itself, most of the writers come from a socialist background. The idea of the book itself was born from conversations I've had with members of the Alliance of Middle Eastern and Northern African Socialists, which is a group I'm also a member of. And as all these uprisings were unfolding, a lot of us were already writing about our respective countries and the uprisings happening there. So I just wanted to, you know, thank them for you know, that's where the idea of this book really found its legs, and you know, we've ended up with this great project. So yeah, I just wanted to make sure I mentioned them.
A wee shout out, and I'm lucky enough to be speaking to some of the other authors as well. So I'm really looking forward to sort of digging deeper into some of these countries with them in future weeks. If you want more of this sort of content, you can head to conter.co.uk. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'll be doing some of these country-specific interviews, as I said, right here. Or you can subscribe to our podcast, Contercast, which you can find on SoundCloud and Spotify. So I look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you very much.